SEP Fanfic Readings presents What the Room Requires by Alydia Rackham. Chapter 9. Day 2. Draco. The next day, or whatever it was, dawned with pink light spreading across the sky and illuminating the clouds with all sorts of rich, unfathomable colors. I sat just outside the edge of the willow room, watching the sunrise, the cool breeze washing over me. As the sun got higher, the barley turned from gray to brown, and finally to that stunning gold I was used to. The sky lit up into brilliant blue, and the white clouds rolled and tumbled with a high wind. It got warm again, but not uncomfortable. I stood up, dusted off my trousers, and started out into the field. The bright sun felt good on my shoulders and the top of my head. It helped get rid of the shadows that had come in the middle of the night. I left Granger behind me. She was still sleeping. I kicked rhythmically through the barley, noticing that it didn't look like anyone had ever walked there before. I stuck my hands in my pockets, lowered my head, and began to think again, like I'd been trying to do yesterday before Granger wanted to start an argument about pigtails. What had happened to the forest? And when I'd stepped outside the other night to see what was going on, it had just disappeared. Poof! And replacing it now was the endless field and spectacular sky. But what did that mean? I couldn't figure it out yesterday, and I wasn't hopeful for today, and the only thing I did know was that the door was now very hidden. We'd had the forest path before. Now, nothing. I could be walking past it at that very moment and have no idea. "Tooraloo-raloo-ra, tooraloo-ralai," I murmured to myself, in a tune that had just entered my head. I didn't remember where I'd heard it, but it went well with the sound of the rushing wind. That is, until I heard the grass crashing behind me. I spun around to see Hermione storming toward me, arms swinging, face tight with consternation and anger. My eyes went wide. "What did you do?" she cried. I frowned at her, indignant. "What do you mean, what did I do?" And suddenly I saw that her face was streaked with tears, and her eyes were filling up with more that tumbled down even as she walked. She jerked to stop, swiped her sleeve across her cheeks, but her brow twitched and her lip trembled. "I just woke up and sat inside that willow and cried for half an hour about nothing," she babbled, sniffing. "I'm like a leaky bathtub. There's nothing wrong. Nothing. I just can't stop." She choked and swiped at her cheeks again with her fingers. I gaped at her. "What in blazes makes you think I did that?" "The song you sang last night," she burst out, sounding like she was about 2 inches away from breaking down completely. "It was sad, and it made me sad all night, even when I was asleep." "You told me to sing anything," I retorted. "I know I did," Hermione spluttered, swallowing hard. "But you had to know something wasn't right. What color were the lights?" I blinked. "What lights?" "The lights I saw just before I went to sleep. The light that covered me when you sang," she practically roared. "I don't know." I put my hands out to the sides, palms up. "Blue?" "Blue? See, that can't be right." She shook her head hard. "When I sang to you, the lights were gold." My mouth fell open. What do you think I was supposed to do with that?" "Use your brains," she sniffed hoarsely, stamping past me. "Granger, it is not my fault." I turned on her, clenching my hands. "Why can't you admit when you've done something wrong?" "Why do you always have to blame someone?" I replied. Her lip trembled, and more tears tumbled. My jaw tightened. It suddenly didn't feel fair, fencing with someone teetering on the edge of hysterics. She was under a spell, clearly. Maybe she was right. Maybe the song made her feel all upended. But I had no idea how to improve the foul mood of a high-maintenance girl like Hermione. I also knew that I needed to improve it, or she was going to take off my head. I racked my brains as she spun around and continued storming away. I glowered, stuck my hands in my pockets again, and followed. What did these silly girls want? Chocolates? Sonnets? Flowers? "I should have known better than to ask you for anything," Hermione fumed. "Since you've never been a—" She stopped suddenly and stared straight down. My heart thudded and I halted. What was in the grass? A snake? A hole? She bent down. I watched her warily as she knelt, and then she picked something. And when she turned around, her tear-streaked face was beaming. Between both hands she held the slender stem of a daffodil so yellow it almost hurt my eyes. She reached up and fingered one of the delicate petals. Then she wiped her tears off on her right sleeve, and no more welled up. She lifted her bright eyes to mine and watched me for a moment. Her smile became smaller, but her eyes lit up more. The wind caught her hair and made it dance around her shoulders, and then— Wait, did she blush? "Thank you," she said. My eyes shot up. I had nothing to do with that." I pointed at it. "Of course," she said lightly, and turned and walked off, drawing a deep breath of the flower's scent. I stared at her, off balance, not sure what had happened. Then I swallowed. I had been thinking about flowers, and she did seem happier all of a sudden. I glanced up at the sky, then narrowed my eyes dangerously at it. "Blasted room," I muttered, and I started walking again. It didn't take me long to catch up to Hermione. My strides were longer, and she wasn't walking very quickly. I slowed my pace to stay behind her. But then she slowed down even more. I watched her, trying to gauge what she was doing. She glanced back at me. She gave me a half smile, uncertain. Then she raised her eyebrows and tilted her head. I mentally tripped. What did she want me to do? Walk beside her? She waited. I swallowed again, fixed an irritated expression on my face, rammed my hands in my pockets, and strode up next to her. But, wonder of wonders, she didn't say anything. She started walking again, smelling her flower, and side by side we strolled around and around that willow, without saying another word for the rest of the day. Hermione. It was magic. That's the only way I can explain it. And thankfully, in the world I'd known since I was 11, that was a perfectly plausible explanation. Because, when I woke up that morning, I was positively drenched in depression. I couldn't do anything about it. I'd sat in that willow and fought with myself for what felt like ages, but I couldn't shake it off, no matter what I did. I just kept weeping like a dripping faucet. And then, when the daffodil popped up in front of me, that sorrow had lifted and vanished in an instant, like a cloud moving back to reveal the full glory of the sun. And then I'd breathed the scent of the flower, and it made my tears stop. And then I turned around and seen the startled, trapped look on Draco's face, and I knew that he'd been the one to conjure it. It was just like the Slytherin pillow, only this time he'd been thinking of me. After that, I felt ridiculously pleasant, almost giddy, but not talkative. I saw the field and the willow and the sky as if they were twice as beautiful as before, because they were. In the back of my head, I knew the flower had driven me to the opposite extreme now, but I definitely preferred it. I was in such a good mood that I even invited Draco to walk next to me, and interestingly, he did. We walked for ages, or several minutes, through that field, and I didn't say anything. I didn't feel inclined to argue about the clouds or talk about the rules of the room or where the forest had to go. I didn't even stop to let myself be disconcerted at the fact that Draco had obviously thought of a flower to cheer me up. I just smiled and smelled my daffodil, and enjoyed the sound of 2 sets of footsteps through the barley instead of 1, though I did have to stop myself from hopping forward and starting to skip. Eventually, as the sky got darker and the wind got quieter, my silliness wore off and I became sensible again, and sleepy. I glanced over at Draco. He was gazing ahead of him, at the very first glimmering evening star. I slowed down, and he did the same. "It's getting dark," I said. He looked at me as if the sound of my voice had surprised him. Then he just nodded. I turned and headed up to the willow. He followed, keeping next to my right shoulder. And then more of my senses came back. Something was bothering him. There was a line between his eyebrows, and he walked with his head down. And he hadn't once tried to start a fight that entire day. I bit my lip as I stepped through the willow curtain, and he trailed after. Now the silence was starting to weigh on me, but I didn't know what to do about it. He traipsed over to the spot by the clock, sat down, and lay back onto a Slytherin pillow and closed his eyes. I stopped. I watched him. That was new. Normally he sat there and stared moodily at the curtain. He was tired. Had he slept at all after he sang me to sleep last night? I sat down by my root and settled back, but I couldn't stop watching him. He shifted, then turned over, lay still for a while, then turned over again. I took a cautious breath. "Would you like me to sing to you?" "Yeah, and have me be the one blubbering into my tea in the morning?" Tea would be nice, I realized, but of course it did not appear. I focused on him again. "I promise I won't sing a sad song." I tried to lighten my voice, "and I promise I'll stop if I see any blue lights." He heaved a sigh, then opened his eyes and glared at the ceiling. "Fine," he ground out. I swallowed, then glanced around, trying to think of something. "I'm waiting," he muttered. "Good grief, Malfoy," I frowned at him. "Give me a moment." His frown just deepened, but then an old song my grandmother used to sing darted into my head, and it made me smile. "Okay, I have one. Ready?" He didn't answer, so I took a breath and started. Great-grandfather met great-grandmother when she was a shy young miss. And great-grandfather won great-grandmother with words more or less like this. Lavender's blue, dilly-dilly, lavender green. If I were king, dilly dilly, I'd need a queen. I knew Draco would think it was a stupid song, but he didn't comment, and as I watched him out of the corner of my eye, I saw his long lashed eyes drift shut. I got quieter, but I kept going. If your dilly dilly heart feels a dilly dilly way, and if you'll answer yes, in a pretty little church on a dilly dilly day, you'll be wed in a dilly dilly dress of lavender blue, dilly dilly, lavender green. There I'll be king, dilly dilly, you'll be my queen. There, the little golden lights, yes, they were gold this time, rose up out of the grass and settled on him, and sank down into his chest. He gave a great sigh, his forehead relaxed, and he fell asleep. For a long while I just studied him in the soft light, as the little golden balls twinkled in the air around me. Then I leaned my head back and relaxed, and when the inevitable questions about the room, how much time was passing, and what I was supposed to be doing here entered my mind, I knocked them out of my head and fell asleep straight away.